potentially for aggregation unless you have a lot of that courage you talked about. And I was wondering if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, no, look, I think I was probably a little bit, I think I jumped over that in a way that I shouldn't have. At one level, a single household doing something has very low meaning for the wider electricity industry, right? Oh, I'm turning something on or off, so what? So aggregation is always needed at some level to provide a wider benefit. A key thing is how much aggregation. So you can envisage providing distribution network level services like voltage management and reverse flows and things. You're aggregating, but you're not aggregating up to wholesale market level, transmission market level. So it's less that you don't need aggregation. I would agree you do. But you can envisage different levels of aggregation, and it might be lower levels of aggregation in network areas might actually open up some more value than adding a whole lot more aggregation and just playing at the wholesale market level. And that tension, maybe we can have it all, okay? I'll play small and I'll play big, but there may be times we have to trade off between those levels of aggregation. And I don't think we want to underestimate the amount of value sitting in network services. If there was a price on it, at the moment, a lot of it's unpriced, right? So you don't get any value. Sorry. Of course, you're going to aggregate up where there are markets, but we should be looking to actually let distributed resources capture some of the value they can offer at distribution network level across a whole range of services. Okay. And then just around on the issues of trust and data privacy and so on are hugely important, and neglected, I think, in a lot of the discussion.
Cool. Thank you very much, Iain. So over to Tim. So the next leading man is an all-male panel. Okay. You're from the Australian Energy Market Regulator, yeah?
Yep. That's all right. All right. A couple of thank yous though, because all I'm really doing is presenting the outcomes as I see them of these three sessions. So we had low marginal cost, security and financing. Getting an economist to talk about system security service is always a little dangerous, so it'll be the one that I'm light on, and I'll look to the engineering people in the crowd to help me out there. A couple of big thank yous though. On the low marginal cost, the paper summarising the session has largely been done now by a guy named Gordon Leslie out of Monash University. Gordon's been doing some fantastic work and has done a really good job of synthesising the material that came out of the day. And on the financing side, James Nelson, no relation to me, has done a pretty good job of pulling a whole bunch of stuff together. A lot of the slides that are in this deck come out of a couple of the presentations from the summit themselves, and Paul Simshauser can take a lot of the credit for some of the slides that are in here. And I guess just one last point that I'd make as I go to the next slide is that when we talk about the national electricity market in 2025, the South Australian Energy Minister jokes and says, oh, you're talking about South Australia in 2015. South Australia, I think, is, to Ken's points earlier, really at the cutting edge of anything that's going on in the world. This slide, which wasn't presented at the symposium, but I think is actually a really useful illustration of what's going on, shows residual demand in South Australia since 2010 to last year at the 5th, 95th and the median percentile. And you can see the challenge now that confronts the system operator and participants in the market when you've got the 5th percentile of demand at basically zero, but you've got the 95th percentile of demand at around 2,000 megawatts. So the nature of the plant in the market that we've currently got probably isn't that well suited to dealing to that type of situation. It was back in 2010. So we've seen this evolution of technology change, and I think that the market, and to be fair, the market bodies and the regulatory bodies are now playing a bit of catch up just because this technology change has been so great. So, low marginal cost. So the overview, which I think Paul gave at the symposium, is that the title of zero marginal cost is misleading. Nothing has a zero marginal cost because we all know there's opportunity cost. Hydro resources have shown us that globally. So when we're talking about wind and solar, the assumption that we're making is that they're purely variable and can't be stored. And we know that with the emergence of battery technology and with demand side coming into the market through new digital technologies. That's going to change over time. So as Paul pointed out, the NEMs had a whole history of having very low marginal running cost plant. Generally, a lot of coal and gas that was going into these power stations was not export parity price exposed, had very high fixed costs. Nothing special about these characteristics. A whole bunch of other industries have had them as well. At all points in time, the NEMs had an upward sloping aggregate supply function, and adding VRE changes the structure but not the nature of the aggregate supply function. Now, the really interesting thing in Australia is we've had these certificate schemes, so basically the RET, that have added a lot of variable renewables. Now, there's a couple of interesting papers that I think are worth reading that people talked about at the symposium. One was written by a colleague of mine, Alan Rye, talking about the dispatchability premium of variable renewable energy. And there's some interesting thoughts that are going on within the Commission itself around how production subsidies could be turned into a de facto carbon price by the quantum of subsidy being a function of the emissions intensity at the point of generation. So I think there are ways of correcting some of these things. Now, the other thing that was spoken about in great detail was the merit order effect, because the merit order effect has in many ways dominated a lot of the public discussion around renewables. You've seen a lot of discussion historically in Australia around renewables being good or bad on the basis of they lower prices or increase prices. And I think what Paul did is he took everyone through the price impression effect, the flexibility effect, and then the stochastic production effects. But I think in the long run, and I guess this was the most important thing that the symposium heard, is that the utilisation effects and the rebound effects basically mean what's important here is average total cost, not the short run cost. Because at the end of the day, we have a derivative market that sits on top of the spot market. So very low marginal cost that's reflected in very low short-term spot price outcomes is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, depending upon how the contract market responds over the top of it. So some research that Paul presented was in and around the dynamic effects of variable renewable entry, and you can see here you've got wind, you've got the profile effect, the merit order effect, the impression effect all in the downward direction, and then you've got that dynamic adjustment. Likewise with solar, you can see there that you've got the profile effect, the merit order effect, and the impression effect. I'm going to run through these quite quickly because I've got a number of slides. So you can see here, what we're really talking about is that the coincident production of renewables basically results in these very low short-run marginal cost technologies all coming in at the same time, depressing the price at certain periods of the day, so that price impression effect. But if we're relying upon some of the existing plant in the market, by definition, if it's got certain costs and those costs are being spread over fewer and fewer megawatt hours, then you're going to see an uplift at the points where those renewables aren't producing, albeit if we make the assumption storage is not in the market. And we've heard lots of discussion earlier today around Snowy 2.0 and some of the other storage technologies that are coming into the market. The other thing is that by definition, if we see more renewables come in, the market's then better suited to having complementary lower capacity factor plant that has a higher average cost. So by definition, you get these price impacts at the beginning and at the end of the day. I'm going to quickly go through this. This is basically just saying you add lots of supply into a market, you get this merit order effect, then you have coal plants exiting in Australia. We've had an uplift in gas prices courtesy of the dynamic that Ken and Iain were talking about, where we've become a big LNG exporter, and for the first time the East Coast has had export parity pricing, and we've now got spot prices that are much higher. But funnily enough, as I speak, prices are starting to come off because we've got record amounts of renewables coming into the market, largely on the basis of some of these pricing impacts. I'm going to flick through this and get to the... Okay. So the outputs of the symposium. These are the three key ones that I think Gordon's got in his paper. So changing technology mixes will change market outcomes, but they do not change the fundamental economic principles behind market design. That's a very categoric statement, and so part of the reason for putting that so categorically is to actually challenge everyone in the audience. We want to hear your feedback because that's the output as it exists today. Market clearing prices in such a market are not necessarily mostly zero, even in an energy-only market, especially with grid-scale storage and active demand side of the market and scarcity pricing. And I know some of the discussion in the earlier sessions in and around demand side the rollout of digital technologies is fundamentally changing what we're seeing is possible in Australia. However, increasing intermittent generator penetration increases the importance for adequately pricing scarcity and all network constraints and services. Such pricing is required to deliver investment incentives for the right technologies to locate at the right locations that should be to efficiently maintain a stable and reliable electrical network. Now, here's where we got to with the unfinished business. So this was what was considered to be things that we need to actually reconsider. The first was network constraints, and there is an active debate in Australia now around nodal versus zonal or regional pricing. And you would think that something as technically complicated and to the layperson pretty boring as that type of subject would go unnoticed. It's pretty fiery debate back in Australia at the moment. The second one was dynamic costs and scheduling. Ahead market considerations. So as VRE penetration increases, the potential gains from co-optimising across multiple periods from a market operator could increase because actions by market participants that impact dynamic system costs can be priced to reflect that action. So the paper as it currently stands, reflecting the outputs of the symposium, has both reconsidering regional pricing and the lack of an ahead market as things that are unfinished business. And that is quite a controversial thing in Australia at the moment to be talking about. So again, your feedback on what you think about that in the context of a very high penetration VRE environment would be very useful. Now the last one, which I think it certainly surprised me because I suspected that this session would just turn into a do we need a capacity market or an energy only market discussion, and that didn't dominate as much as I thought it would. So one of the things that did come up, and it's certainly reflected in the paper at the moment, is the importance of long horizon forward prices. At the moment you can get reasonable derivative contract cover looking at getting coverage from the spot price for about 3 years into the future. But of course, if you're building heavy fixed cost infrastructure and you've got lots of debt and equity providers saying, oh, you know, how much certainty have we got? The longer you can contract that away to somebody who's better placed to deal with that risk, the better. So there was a bit of discussion about capacity markets as an alternative to energy-only markets, but there was also this idea of expanding the retailer reliability obligation concept. And I say concept because the paper doesn't reflect the RRO as it currently is expressed. But just reading from it, if the NEM approach to long-run resource adequacy is deemed to need changing, a way to preserve the appropriate performance in investment incentives while improving hedge liquidity is to mandate procurement levels and reporting of long-run contract position by retailers, i.e. you align the debt and equity horizons with contract position length. And again, that's a pretty controversial thing to put up there because you're basically telling the market how to contract to deal with risk. So I'm going to pause there and just see if anyone's got any questions, and what I'm hoping for more is more suggestions so we can improve some of these papers as we write them up.
Just a comment, I guess you've got a tension between having these long-term contracts on one side, and then you get less variable pricing, which makes all the smoothing and good PV and electric vehicles and so on, all that work. So you need kind of variable prices. But if you have if you have 100% renewable, then the price is always zero unless you've got no supply. So it seems to me you need, if you want to go down that road, you need some artificial rules basically that say once supply gets this much below demand or above demand, once there's a gap, then you make a certain price by fiat. It's a bit like Bill Hogan's sort of scheme, I think.
The operating reserve demand curve?
Yeah. I think
that comes up, I think, in the financing section. So yes, it was spoken about as a potential, and that's part of the challenge we've got here, that a lot of these issues, go over each other. There's a lot of cross-referencing across all of these various sessions. But yes, I completely take that point, yeah.
If I might just make a comment about that operating demand reserve, that essentially is a proxy for demand response. Okay? So if you actually have active demand response in the market, then demand will price in and it will say, well, at this stage, we're going for consumption, and that's what the price is.
This is fantastic. This is what we were actually hoping to get out of the session, so please,
Thank you.
please keep it going.
Okay, so sorry about this. So would you like me to repeat what I said, or is this all right? Okay, right, the next bit. Okay, so the next bit that I wanted to specifically ask about was this. We had Mark O'Malley here, was it last year, Steve, or maybe the year before? And his take in terms of household demand response, at least in Ireland, was that the benefits to the end user was not enough to entice them to get involved in any sort of a scheme. Effectively, the money that was left over on the table, as he put it, was a couple of pints of beer in a year, right? So I'm sort of constantly concerned about whether the role of an aggregator will in fact take off, and how is it that you could entice folks to make the rational choice if the payoffs are relatively minuscule? So this, I think, is a standing economic question.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I'm not sure which session it was, spoke about, it was the nature of the inertia of getting an industry to develop in and around new technology. So has anyone here got a Google Home in their home? One of those things that you can remotely control things with? You can literally, from the other side of the world, turn lights on and off and all that type of stuff. It's only a matter of time before that technology, somebody develops an app that allows you to utilise the spot price to slightly change the thermostat or whatever it might be. To your point, it's probably an unexplored area of research from what I can tell around what the fixed costs of getting all of that technology in place are versus what the benefits might look like. The dynamic, though, in the Australian policy debate is very much around this demand response, so it's a good piece of caution you've given us around not getting too ahead of ourselves. I'll just go the two last questions. Sorry.
We already, have that to some extent, because I know I get alerts when energy prices are really high, and I use my phone to change my thermostat. So I already respond to price differences. It's not a real-time price difference, but at aggregate. So this is already happening in many markets.
Yep. Paul, did you have something?
I was going to basically say the same.
Great.
The one thing I would say about demand response and trying to get activity you take the state of Queensland, they do have something like 700 or 800 megawatts of active load from households, which is quite a lot for a system with a peak load of, the total system load of about 10,000 on a very hot day. But that's largely come through incentives. When you sign up to put in your pool, there's this, if you sign up, you get an extra $100, and the local network can switch your pool on and off through a ripple control, basically, for lack of a better term. Same with hot water loads and so on. So it seems that probably because it's only got a beer in it, maybe better to bundle up all the beers in one afternoon and give you $100 so you can buy 10 beers for the next 10 or 15 years, because you then put onto that. So it's sort of almost, you almost need that, and I think Alison pointed towards it earlier today, you sort of almost need to intervene in these markets in a way for the individual households, because the gains are just too small. Compare that to a 140 megawatt zinc smelter in Townsville. Well, they're hyperactive. They can run their system down to 30 megawatts stably and leave themselves off for hours on end without any real disruption to the efficacy of their systems, other than the fact that they don't produce a lot of zinc. But they've managed to work out over the years that actually sometimes it's a lot more fun and a lot more profitable to be an energy trader than a zinc maker. And so they seamlessly flip between the two modes now, and they don't have an electricity retailer because it's become very profitable for them. So I think that there is, the demand side can do it if there's money on the table for them, but evidently it needs to be a lot when it's households.
All right, I'm going to rocket through some of this just because I know we're conscious of time. So when we got to system security, it would be fair to say that the engineers took over, and that was probably a good thing. So I'm going to do my best to kind of summarise where I think things got to. So the overview at the moment is that almost all of the capital substitution that's occurred through the VRE switch out of thermal has resulted in services that were once provided for free as a byproduct of the energy provision no longer being provided at the same levels as they once were. And the ones that people spoke about, I think most commonly were frequency, inertia, voltage and system strength. And the thing that was noted was that the market is increasingly becoming not a market because interventions are so frequent. And so if interventions are going on all the time, then by definition, we know it's not a market. So in terms of the outputs, I think one of the things that came through quite clearly was that some services can be prescribed by the TNSP, the DNSP, given their common good nature. Others can be priced, so in other words, you can create markets for them. One of the things which came through quite clearly to me was that transitional arrangements might be required. And I know at the moment there's a whole bunch of discussions going on back in Australia around mandating primary frequency control. There was some discussion around the commonality of approach, at least from a principles perspective, around transmission and distribution issues. So in other words, not having completely separate approaches for those. And I think that the last point was that where possible, use co-optimised markets. And then the big question for some of these things was, are we doing that at a local level or a regional level? What's the appropriate way of defining where that system service exists? And of course, then you're introducing issues of market power, particularly in the transition. How'd I go, Iain, being a non-engineer? Is that all right? All right, I might move on to financing because I'm conscious of time. So there's been an enormous amount of capitals that's come into the generation of the network. If I go to what we can see here, you can see that we've seen the market respond to that particular spot price. So where spot prices have been high, you've seen investment follow it. But I think that the other thing which it's worth noting is that most of the investment that's come into the market has been policy induced. So this slide shows the various plant investment that's come into the market, and you can see that in 2012 and 2014 people basically put the shovels away, and that was largely a result of a bit of a stalling in a lot of the policy that was there to support renewable energy investment. So in other words, policy certainty or policy continuity is a really important ingredient for making investors feel that they can keep coughing up the dough. So if you think about the enormous flow of capital that's come into the market, you can see here across TNSPs, DNSPs, renewables, and then gas and network M&A, you're talking, in the order of, $5 billion a year all the way out through the last decade. So it's an enormous amount of money. I think it goes to your point earlier that there are literally trillions of dollars awaiting a home at the moment, and people are looking for a good place to put some money. One of the other things which came up, and this is a slide that Paul had in his deck, there's a big refinancing challenge that Australia has. So if we go changing the market design quite significantly, how are the people who've put up money to date going to react when they have to refinance it? And I think that was one of the real light bulb moments for a lot of the people in the room who aren't economists and finance people, in the sense that introducing new risk through regulatory change is not something that particularly debt providers normally like to see. So outputs of the symposium. It was important to recognise that the increasing proportion of costs being fixed. So as we move into this world, building a wind farm, building a solar plant, building a battery, it's largely all fixed costs. And by definition, fixed cost industries tend to look like infrastructure plays. So there's a dynamic there around how these new assets fit in a market with quite significant price volatility risk. Market design is not necessarily the issue, as one of the issues that we heard. It's the risk allocation and technology price deflation concerns from some of the investment community. Some alignment of investor financing requirements and policy could be useful. And there are missing markets around system security. So when we're thinking about batteries, demand-side response, some of these other things, it's important to have the right price signals. And they don't necessarily have to be spot market, organised spot markets, but some form of price is important. I've tried to do my best to catch up time.
You did amazingly well. Okay. Any additional questions? Okay. What did you mean by refinancing? I mean,
Basically, they're coming back to renegotiate the provision of the debt because it expires at that point in time.
right. Oh, okay. In that sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So is this from the utilities perspective? Or?
And for project financed
Right. Okay.
facilities, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Any further questions? Okay. So
Great.
we'll have Ken back. 25 minutes.
Okay, so I know Tim was having trouble as a non-engineer speaking about engineering, so I'm going to be a physicist talking about social science. Okay, so the two areas that I'm going to cover here are resilience and the just transition. Just to indicate that, again, this is the work of other people, and I'll indicate who those people are. So first of all, in the resilience session, which was really looking at a world of increased risks, principally from climate change and cybersecurity, we looked at all these issues: climate change, the shift to what is known as the Internet of Energy, the cybersecurity issues that might bring with it, the quantum technology fixes that could perhaps mitigate that, and then finally the societal inputs. And the key people here involved were Pierluigi Mancarella from the University of Melbourne, Mark Howden from ANU, who's Director of the Climate Change Institute there, Leslie Seebeck, again from ANU, Director of the Cybersecurity Institute, Andreas Baumhoff from Quintessence Labs, who actually makes quantum technology and sells it. And finally, the person who's pulling the chapter together, that's Liz Ratnam from ANU. So what were the key elements here? Well, first of all, climate change. So climate change brings with it not only an increase in the mean risk, so increases in temperature, increases in sea level, all these sort of things, but also in some of these parameters it brings with it a greater range of risks. So you've got a greater range of variations of temperature, a greater range of variations in rainfall, all these sorts of things. And that has a direct impact on infrastructure. You've got to be able to cope with a much wider range of circumstances. And as we heard a bit earlier in the day, the efficiency of energy use declines as temperature increases. Solar cells are less efficient at higher temperatures. Power stations that rely on thermal processes are much less efficient at higher temperatures, etc., etc., etc. Even wires sag and get longer and cause greater risk of bushfires at higher temperatures. So it's important to recognise there's a direct feedback from climate change into the energy sector already, even if we're not talking about what effects this might have on demand and other things. Third thing to note is that there is actually a correlation between these risks. So as we've seen in the eastern seaboard of Australia this summer, the combination of world record elevated temperatures and record drought conditions combined to produce the biggest bushfire risk that we've seen. Okay, so these are correlations between risk factors that are important. Another learning is that increasing the complexity of systems, in the Internet of Energy, you might think it's getting better because you've got greater redundancy of pathways. This does help a bit, but it doesn't eliminate risk completely. So just simply making things more complicated doesn't necessarily get around the problem. And another key learning is from the climate perspective that it's important to build in new resilience measures rather than just tinkering with the old ones. In other words, you've got to think outside the box in order to cope with many of these risks. So that was the learnings from the climate change side of things. Then from the cybersecurity perspective, as I mentioned, we're moving towards the Internet of Energy with millions of generators, millions of demand response capabilities, and millions of storage providers if you think of everybody's battery in their house or battery in their vehicle. And again, while this Internet of Energy could be robust and reliable in the same way that the Internet is, because you take out one node here, you've always got another one over there to take over, it does bring with it increased risk. And the resilience of the system has to deal with this. It's also going to require a more advanced sensing and communications network and sophisticated computing to control this Internet of Energy. And again, the stability issues and the feedback loops and all the rest that go with this require very careful design. And then, of course, this all creates a greater possibility of cyber interdiction, of somebody getting in, a malicious actor, and bringing down the system. And indeed, because everything is going to be connected in the Internet of Energy, it could be your fridge that may be the next weak link that brings down the grid. And if you think that's funny, it's already happened. And again, multiple redundancy and multiple pathways provide only a partial mitigation in this regard. So the lessons from climate also apply to cyber. And finally, the thing to note is that the big issue here is temporal. Okay, so the average attack on a major system like this, and I'm speaking from experience here coming from the Australian National University, which experienced this last year, it only takes on average 15 hours for a malicious actor to attack and infiltrate and potentially destroy a given installation. However, you may not know about this on average for another 8 or 9 months, as indeed was our case at ANU. And then it may take you many years to fix it. So there's this incredible asymmetry in the system. Now, many years to fix is not an option for an electricity market, okay? Even responding on hours to an hour-based attack is a long time. So then we look at quantum technology. So the Internet of Energy is going to rely on massive information transfer, not only by the operator but by people operating in the market. But you might want to have links between nodes of the market that are very secure. And the issue is that quantum computing is on the way. It's in its infancy. It's, there's only a few qubit size quantum computers operating now, and this is from a physics background. But eventually these have the ability through factorisation to crack any classical code. Okay, so any code that you use on your phone, for your internet banking, that could be cracked. And the same is true of the operation of the Internet of Energy. Fortunately, the good news is that quantum technology already exists in quantum communications that can provide secure information transfer. And indeed, the way that this operates is that it provides a quantum key distribution service that uses entanglement from the original source between the bits of information that are sent out, so that if somebody eavesdrops over here, you know about it over there. Okay, so this already exists. This is the sort of technology that Quintessence Lab sells. So the good thing is we already have technology that can do the type of protection that we need, but only over relatively short distances. There was actually an article that appeared in the media today about a transfer over 50 kilometres of optical fibre of such a system. So that's kind of the extent it can do at the moment. It will need to do much further than that into the future. So the bottom line is that we eventually expect that quantum technology is going to improve system security, but it will only be available to those who can afford to and who have the capability to deploy it, because this is not simple technology. And then finally, on the resilience side of things, societal inputs. So one of the issues is societal trust, and the fact that the system can be brought down means that people will trust the system less, which means that they might engage with it less and they might also not be prepared to pay for it. So this is going to be an issue. And there is going to therefore be a balance or a trade-off in society between openness of the system and sabotaging the system, of having confidentiality in the system and enabling the system to be spied upon, and between integrity and subversion. So all of this has to be traded off. And in the end, it'll be society that determines the tolerance on the system resilience. In other words, how much outage they're willing to put up with in the face of these types of resilience problems, whether they be climate change or whether they be cyber attacks. Recognising, of course, that zero tolerance implies infinite amounts of money to fix it. And of course, this means that societal engagement is going to be a prerequisite in future markets for determining this system tolerance, but it's going to need transparency of information to make these good decisions, and it should be evolutionary and responsive to the system in order to optimise the outcome. So the bottom line is society has a significant role to play in our resilience response. Okay, so now on to another big societal issue, and that is the just transition. So electricity markets, as we know, are in a state of flux, and this could well leave people behind, not just consumers who can't afford to make the changes, but also workers in industries that are going to change, like coal generation. So what we're looking at here is a number of things. Vulnerable consumers is one, planning the transition is another, and designing the market. Vulnerable consumers, the most vulnerable members of society are the least able to cope with climate change or technology change, so we have to remember to bring them with us. They are also least able to adopt the measures to improve their energy use, for example, through partial subsidies on solar or insulation or any other methods, which primarily benefit the middle classes who can afford to do that, and generally people on very high incomes don't care. It's potentially the case that you can create efficient policies that unintentionally lead to inequitable outcomes. For example, renewable energy certificates that favour those with the means to install rooftop solar. And some policies, such as carbon pricing, can help you with addressing equity by enabling wealth distribution or redistribution that enable you to compensate people who are experiencing hardship arising from the transition. And in the same vein, delaying these potentially equitable long-term solutions by having short-term patches through regulation can also cause prices to go up, and this price increase will have a regressive effect. Okay, so now technological change. It's important to plan for this in a measured way in order to avoid disruption, such as through the planned phase out of coal. But there is a risk that this rapid renewable adoption that we're experiencing at the moment, without planning in the way, could push out coal and gas in a way that can result in social dislocation, particularly amongst those involved in the fossil fuel industry. And as I said right at the beginning, Australia is currently transitioning to renewables at the most rapid rate of any country in the world, and it's currently without such a plan. And in analogy with Frank Iozzo's diagram this morning of the rodeo rider with the government lagging the horse, this is my version of the raging bull of renewables leading the government in its planning for the transition. Okay, so they're not even on the bull. Maybe they're underneath the bull. Finally, we come to designing the market. What does this all mean for market design? It means that the market design in the future has to make good choices that enhance the transition, and particularly not to create confusion that enables profiteering from imperfect markets. So social equity should be a key component for market design, and not simply to highlight market efficiency. So in other words, you don't want to introduce a carbon price without some form of wealth redistribution. The market design needs to be complemented by measures that maintain equity. So in other words, if you're going to have insulation subsidies, you introduce some form of means testing in order that this doesn't become middle-class welfare. And finally, cost-benefit analysis should be used to include societal externalities and then judge the effectiveness of the market design. So that's it, and thank you very much for your attention. Time for some questions.
Thank you very much, all three. You make New Zealand energy policy seem extremely boring. So that was very exciting. So any questions for Ken first? Or if not, maybe we can open it to the whole floor.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've got a question for you while you're waiting there. What is this picture showing and where is it?
Thank you, Ken, for an interesting talk and adding new insights into the security of supply debate from a different perspective. And you've given us a catalogue of risks that the existing electricity networks and the electric system in general are exposed to. And we can expect that these risks will just amplify over time. But we also know that electricity networks are regulated entities. And being an economist, I think it's my right to ask you, is the existing regulatory framework and regime in the Australian national electricity market adequate enough to address these increasing risks? If not, how should it evolve? Thank you.
Well, particularly with respect to the performance of assets, large assets under extreme climatic conditions, the answer is no. There is not that ability to address that through a market mechanism, and indeed maybe you can't. You know, the other risks, the cyber risks, again, you know, that's something that we're going to face through every facet of society, not just the electricity sector. But again, you know, how much outage is society prepared to wear in the electricity network because of our inability to protect it against cyber attack? Well, that's a good and open question. They're not willing to spend an infinite amount of money, so they must be able to wear at least some risk. So these are really societal and governance questions that need to be answered first, and then the money has to be developed as a resource to be able to cope with it, and that's a government decision.
Okay, I'm going to indulge myself. So, I mean, in all three of your presentations, the energy market's at the centre of it, but a lot of people want to disconnect. And,
Yep.
To what extent do you know, and the technology, I mean, Australia, you know, the load curve, you know, solar match up for a lot of people. To what degree are you considering this? I mean, you know.
Yeah, so that's a question that worries a lot of people in the energy industry, the so-called electricity death spiral, where, you know, people disconnect, you're left with people on the grid who are unable to afford the ability to disconnect, and therefore they end up defaulting, and then the business model falls over. Exactly. So that has a potentially non-zero prospect of happening, but I think people are realising more and more that the grid is actually their friend. When you go off-grid, you've got to take into account the fact that the equipment that you've bought is going to be operating 100% of the time, and that is actually not the case. So you have to understand when you do that what it is that you're taking on. So it's not just a matter of, you know, being able to decide that you're going to go off-grid and then have complete system security with your off-grid system that you've bought. That's not a given. So there's a trade-off between staying with the grid and having that as your backup and being off-grid, you know, for most of the usage that you have.
But I mean, if you're thinking of it as an individual household, I agree with you, but maybe someone's providing you an energy service with potential backup. I mean, if we're thinking agriculture and so on, with various backups.
That's right. Well, I mean, and, you know, this is what has happened after the bushfires. The bushfires destroyed a lot of infrastructure, including transmission lines. And so the networks are now saying to people at the end of long and expensive transmission lines, maybe you should think about being off-grid, because it's going to take us a lot of money to be able to reconnect you, and maybe you're much better off just going straight to a microgrid.
Okay. Sorry, I'm One other question. So it's not a national market. So what are the prospects for connecting East and West Coast and the prospects of sending that energy? So how realistic, yeah? This is a forward-looking exercise.
Yep.
You know, where are the plans to connect East-West and then go send power to Asia?
So this is now reaching the stage where people are looking at making huge investments. You'll have seen announcements about the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is partnering with us to look at exports from the northwest of Australia and the Pilbara. You'll have seen the announcement by Sun Cable, who we've also talked to about their plan to export electricity to Singapore. And there are other people who are thinking, well, if we do that internationally, why don't we just link East and West Coasts, as you say? I think I might have seen a potential paper on this somewhere in the conference somebody might have put in. So these things are being considered, absolutely, and HVDC allows you to be able to do that these days. And the other good thing about East-West is the excellent renewable energy resource over in WA, particularly with solar in that part of the country, allows you to demand shift to the East Coast perfectly with a 3-hour time difference.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. Why don't let the conference organizer speak? I'll speak last, okay. Tough love.
You didn't mention smart grid, which I thought was supposed to fix a lot of these problems, reliability, resilience and so on. Is it sitting there in the background or?
No, that's also part of the picture. I didn't talk a lot about that, but it will be a real part of the future design process. I'm more concerned in this presentation with threats to the smart grid, why the smart grid might be not as smart as we might like, and that was really the aim of this talk on the resilient side of things, but certainly making the grid resilient by being smart, that's a key factor.
Okay, any more questions?
There's one just there.
Oh, sorry.
Non-physicist asking potentially ignorant physics question. Given that like quantum supremacy was only like really achieved last year, on what timescale do you think these like cybersecurity quantum computing concerns would be relevant? And do you think like, I feel like in any reasonable time frame, basically like just like dumb security design and other dimensions seems more important.
So you're asking about what are the timeframes that we might expect for a quantum computer to be a serious threat to these issues? I'd say we're thinking at least a decade